Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And I am meeting you once again with lecture 18 of Novel 2, that is Modern Novel. What we were doing in our last talk, we were talking about themes, motifs and symbols used in The Lord of Flies by William Golding. Today's talk is going to be an extension based on the same lines where we will try to explain on the use of allegory, because the story, the narrative is an allegorical narrative. And we will also like to talk about characters, and we would like to have a character analysis and critical discussion regarding their qualities discussed in the story. Well, The Lord of Flies could be read as one big allegorical story. An allegory, we all know, and I refresh your memory about, is a story with a symbolic level of meaning where the characters and setting represent other things like political system, social system, religious beliefs and figures, and or philosophical viewpoints. Let's try a sample. The island represents the whole world. That is one common allegorical interpretation. And I'm referring to the island where boys get lost, where they find themselves after having their plane crashed. Ralph's conch led Parliament represents democratic government. We know that the play is a kind of representation of 20th century. And 20th century was the era of big chaos and disturbance. And we know the role of World War in that too. In that background, Jack's tribalism represents autocratic government. Piggy represents the forces of rationalism, science and intellect, which get ignored at society's peril. Simon represents a kind of natural morality. And see how these things are done. Of course, you could argue with this breakdown, and you can add into according to your own understanding, and subtract things as well. You can add some new, you can omit some already have been discussed with you, but that all depends how do you interpret this narrative. Maybe Simon represents the religious side of humanity as well, or maybe Jack represents cruelty, or maybe Roger does the same. But the point is that they are not fully developed and rounded characters so much as they are symbols. The only time we pull out of the allegory is at the very end of the novel, when the other real world breaks through the imaginary barrier around the island. Yet this is also the moment when the real question of the allegory hits home. Who will rescue the grown-ups? Well, if you look at the body paint, that Jack starts on the island by painting his face initially by the coal and blood, and later on they all use the same patterns to create a sense of uniformity and unity. There's a reason. Some women put on more makeup when they are going on a job interview or a first date or first meeting with their loved ones. At those neat-looking black stripes under football players' eyes are more effective at looking awesome than guarding against the sun. So Jack is the first one to pretty himself up, and he does it because he figures out that his pig prey keeps spotting him. "They see me, I think," he says. "Something pink under the trees." And so he gets the bright idea to paint his face. Dazzle paint like things trying to look like something else. So this idea of creating an identity is basically comes from the real world, where identity is created by the appearances. But the point turns out to be more than camouflaging into one kind of identity to be a part of that group you want to represent. It doesn't just make Jack look like something else, say part of the forest, it actually makes him into something else. It creates another identity for him. It makes him into a savage and then the chief. When his face is finished, the mask was nothing of its own behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. With the paint on the face, Jack isn't coy leader Jack anymore. He's a savage ready to be chief boy or participant of the parliament. And Jack isn't the only one who has an inner savage. Eventually, almost all the boys paint their faces too. Ralph and his tiny band of still civilized boys know that it's just paint, but that doesn't change its power. When they plan to go take Piggy's glasses back from Jack, Eric hesitates, but they'll be painted. You know how it is? And everyone does. They understand only too well the liberation into savagery that the concealing paint brought. So, there you have it. You know it. Golding isn't being tricky with their symbols and paint. Paint liberates the boys into savagery, into the kind of identity they want to disguise their real selves in, freeing them to act in a way that schools, parents, and any other kind of authoritative figure they have been involved with, freeing them to act in a way that any authority would let them to be, and policemen have never let them. In other words, the paint represents the savage and the animal and the wish of freedom within. It doesn't disguise the boy's true nature. In fact, it reveals it. Now a word about wounds. From the moment the boys land on the island, we begin to see signs of destruction. Over and over, we are told of the scar that the plane leaves in the greenery. The water they bath in is warmer than blood. The boys leave gashes in the trees when they travel. The lightning is a blue-white scar, and the thunder is the blow of a gigantic whip. Later, a sulphurous explosion. Well, if you're trying to answer the big question of whether the boys are violent by nature or are made violent by the unfortunate situation, you could argue that because the island nature is already so violent, think the thunder and lightning, that has nothing to do with the boys' situation. The boys couldn't help but become part of its nature, part of its savagery when they arrived. Or that the boys are the bringers of destruction, running the island and ruining the island into paradise. We would like to go with option 1 because for that we have several supporting and substantiated events, but we are pretty sure that Golding wants us to pick up option 2 as well and ponder and think about it. Well, now starting a word with characters and starting with all the characters and keeping Ralph as a priority into this discussion. Ralph is like the school president, football, quarterback and prom king all rolled into one. 12-year-old package, we are thinking a young boy. He's the first lost boy we meet on the island, and he's definitely the best. After all, he's elected as chief. But what makes him chief worthy, or what makes him get elected by the boys or by the members as chief? Jeff can also be known as Golden's boy. Mostly he's all American, we mean all British good looks. He's fair and attractive. More than that, he has the conch, power to speak, and he can blow it. He knows, he's skilled. Because the conch symbolizes power as well as order and discipline, Ralph gets a head start in the island power structure. But he also knows what that power's for. Instead of getting caught up in the hunting bloodshed, he proposes something practical, something more disciplined, more human and sensible. And we'll say it British. Start a fire and then watch it to make sure it doesn't go out. He's got nerve too. When someone has to go look for the beast, Ralph appoints himself. When he's scared, he himself together binds himself together with his will. Meaning that he's able to force himself to do something he really doesn't want to for the good of the group. So he, in a way, he gets worthy of calling, to be called chief. And so here is our question. Is Ralph innately a good leader, or are these characteristics be innately in nature? Or is he only a good leader as long as everyone agrees to live by civilized rules or rules identified by Ralph? Unfortunately for Ralph, it looks like his power depends on civilization. Check out how he approaches his office. He lifted the conch. Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things. A chief to Ralph is a sort of first among equals deal. Someone who's elected to keep things in order. As he thinks, if you are a chief, you have to think, you have to be wise. You have to grab at a decision. So, see that word decide used twice here. For Ralph, chiefdom is about leading people, leading who can't decide for themselves. It's not about personal power or triumph for being superior than other. It's about making sure that the group that belongs to you is taken care of. All those who are deprived of that quality or courage of making a decision can take your help and get benefited from the decision power that you are gifted with. Which means making sure the little ones get looked after. Keeping people from pooping where they eat, literally, and getting that darned fire lit. But is Ralph innately good? Maybe he doesn't throw rocks at any little boys. He doesn't paint his face all crazy to establish his power over others. He insists that there is a good island, and at the same time our little golden boy isn't exactly innocent. So this sketch that comes out of the story, the narrative by William Golding, that describes the quality of the leader that he sees into a man, how do they match with the qualities of Jack, self-proclaimed leader and selected leader later on after Ralph, is a question that you probably would need to think about. And then decline and fall. One of Ralph's first action is taking off his clothes. Believe us when we say that striping is never a good sign. It's the first step to becoming a lawless savage. Here's how it goes down. And the fall and decline starts. He jumped down from the terrace. The sand was thick over his black shoes, and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. Then he leaped back on the terrace, pulled off his shirt and stood there among the skull-like coconuts with green shadows from the palms and forest sliding over his skin. He undid the snake clasp of his belt, lugged off his shorts and pants, and stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. And this quote has been taken from the text as reference to support this idea I just presented. Sure, this is probably a more sensible way for him to run around a deserted island or a place where nobody is to be is going to notice him for what he's wearing, that in black shoes and garters. But it's also a sign that underneath his school uniform, Ralph is just as much a little savage as any of the other boys, and nature does hide somewhere everyone. We get a hint of this even earlier when he shrieks with laughter about Piggy's name. Ralph may be a good kid, but he's still a kid. So maybe nature is governed by wisdom or learned wisdom, but nature still stays inside, as raw as it ever has been. And when it comes to hunting, Ralph starts to seem even more sinister. The first time he wounds a pig, he talks excitedly and thinks that maybe hunting was good after all. It wasn't that bad. And then when the party at Jack's starts to heat up, they find themselves eager to take a place in this demented but partly secure society, which pretty soon turns into the brutal murder of Simon. No matter how much Ralph tries to convince himself, but we left early, it's not true. He helped kill Simon. He was a part of it. The beast lives in him too, somewhere. So come to think of it, that just might be what saves him. At the end, he's all animal. He launched himself like a cat, stabbed, snarling with the spear, and the savage doubled up, keeping himself alive long enough to roll away from Jack's band and end up at the feet of the naval officer, safe and sound. Well, there is a change, or there are changes. We don't know what Ralph is going to be like now that he's back home, but we get the feeling he might be different than he was ever when he landed on the island. All that British order that he relied on, now he knows that it's nothing more than a thin coating of civilization. Unless the civilization is in proper care of a rule or law establishment, it doesn't mean much. Give him a sharpened stick and a big carcase and he's going to be ripping at the flesh with everyone else. His first big philosophical movement comes during a late afternoon assembly, when the light makes everything look different. To Ralph, that means they are different. If face is different when lit from above or below, what is a face? What is anything if it changes its meaning through just a minute change in the angle it is seen through? To translate this idea, the island makes people lose their meaning or lose their real identities, or maybe it helps them reveal their real identities. When the boys paint themselves and act like savages, he decides they are completely different beings than the British boys who came to the island all trained and wise and learned. To Ralph, this break in logic is a way of coping, a way of dealing with the horrors of such circumstances. But is he right? Isn't that the time to test his real learning? Well, that's a question I'm leaving you with. Well, check out the way he gradually deteriorates over the course of the novel. As order and rules go by the wayside, so does the order within Ralph's own head, own thinking. He can remember that he wants a signal fire, but he can't remember why. He knows it's something to do with smoke, but then he can't put two and two together. Piggy has to help him out repeatedly, and the gap in Ralph's train of thoughts worsens as the novel progresses. When they confront Jack and the savages, Piggy has to remind him, remember what we came for, the fire, my spaces. And Ralph remembers, but barely. And that just might make Ralph our tragic figure. Sure, Piggy and Simon both die, but Ralph is the one who has to go back to civilization with the knowledge that underneath his schoolboy uniform, he is nothing more than a lawless, orderless, savage, and animal discovered by himself. So this was all about Ralph's character. Now, looking at the Ralph's character, since Ralph is the major character and is also known as the tragic hero of the narrative too, there are several perspectives regarding this character. So far what we did, we analyzed it from one perspective, however there is another. Let's see how does it differ or match with the one we already discussed. We know that Ralph is the athletic, charismatic protagonist of Lord of the Flies. Elected the leader of the boys at the beginning of the novel, Ralph is the primary representative of order, civilization, and productive leadership in the novel. While most of the other boys initially are concerned with playing, having fun, and avoiding work, Ralph sets about building huts and thinking of ways to maximize their chances of being rescued and well fed. For this reason, Ralph's power and influence over the other boys are secure at the beginning of the novel, and he is well respected. However, as the group gradually succumbs to savage instincts over the course of the novel, Ralph's position declines perceptually while Jack's rises. Eventually, most of the boys, except Piggy only, leave Ralph's group for Jack's, and Ralph is left alone to be hunted by Jack's tribe, the tribe of savages. Ralph's commitment to civilization and morality and order and discipline is strong, and his main wish is to be rescued and return to the society of adults. In a sense, this strength gives Ralph a moral victory at the end of the novel when he casts the Lord of the Flies to the ground and takes up the stake it is impaled on to defend himself against Jack's hunter. Still, he doesn't give up. In the earlier parts of the novel, you would observe that Ralph is unable to understand why the other boys would give in to base instincts of bloodshed and bloodlust and barbarism. The sight of the hunters chanting and dancing is baffling and distasteful to him. And you will also know that as the novel progresses, however, Ralph, like Simon, comes to understand that savagery exists within all the boy. Ralph remains determined not to let the savagery overwhelm him. After all, he was still a kid, and he still had this, after all, he has this animal within too. And only briefly does he consider joining Jack's tribe in order to save himself, or probably Piggy, or probably to satisfy their need, hunger. When Ralph hunts a boar for the first time, however, he experiences the exhilaration and thrill of bloodlust and violence. So when he attends Jack's feast, he is swept away by the frenzied dances on the edge of the group. and participates in the killing of Simon. This first-hand knowledge of the evil that exists within him, as within all human beings, is tragic for Ralph, and it plunges him into listless despair for a time. But this knowledge also enables him to cast down the Lord of the Flies at the end of the novel. And Ralph's story ends semi-tragically though. Although he is rescued and returned to civilization, but when he sees the naval officer, he weeps with the burden of his new knowledge about the human capacity for evil and the changes which took place in his own personality, quite silently and quite unknowingly. And that's the burden of knowledge that he bears now. Now, after Ralph's character, the other prominent character that we need to bring into discussion is Jack's one. Jack, for Jack, the island is like the best summer vacation ever. He gets to swear, play war games, hunt things down and paint his face, all without any grown-ups around to send him to his room for accidentally killing the neighbors. Like Ralph, Jack is charismatic and inclined to leadership too. Unlike Ralph, he gets off on power and abuses his position above others. So he's basically an 80s teen villain without good hair and daddy's credit card. Let's see how he transforms from arrogant coy boy into painted savage. And probably in comparison to Ralph's character, he can be understood as not so golden's boy or a golden boy in both ways. Jack is a kind of ugly boy, though he's presented as ugly, but I don't know, when I see the picturized version of this narrative, I don't find him as ugly as the interpretations would want him to be. Well, very soon you are going to watch the movie based on Lord of the Flies, so I would want you to note your own observations and then narrate your answers in the light of that. Well, according to the narrator, he's tall, thin and bony, and his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without silliness. Out of this face stared two light blue eyes, frustrated now and turning or ready to turn to anger. Well, we have just met him and we are already getting a bad feeling. Where Ralph is described as fair and attractive, Jack is freckled and red-headed. Everyone knows redheads are evil. And check out those angry eyes. It's no surprise that Jack can't wait to pick up a spear. Ralph is elected, an elected leader, because he's cute and seems pretty mature and wise and someone who respects civilization, and he's our protagonist for pretty much the same reason. Well, but Jack doesn't get it. He thinks that he deserves to be chief because he's chapter chorister and head boy. He can sing C sharp, in other words, for no good reason at all. He should be leader because he's always been leader in the past, even though that leadership was based on something completely unrelated to his ability to govern. A nice singing voice. That's it. Well, the problem with this kind of social structure is that it's not based on anything real at all. At first, Jack seems ready to help Ralph, establishing order. We have got to have rules and obey them. After all, we are not savages, we are English, and the English are best at everything. That these are the initial sharing and exchange of ideas and expressions that we witness and read in the story. That doesn't exactly sound like a kid who's 5 seconds away from slaughtering a wild pig and painting himself with its blood, right? Well, but saying he have to have rules because we are English and awesome is, when you think about it, identical to saying I should be leader because I can sing C sharp. It's entirely meaningless, and it's jingoistic too. And it disguises the fact that Jack is actually a pretty scary dude. As soon as there is no civilization to keep him in line, keep him controlled, he, unlike Ralph, falls out of line majorly. Well, power corrupts, and corrupts absolutely. Jack's litany of evil is pretty impressive and explains the idiom as well, the proverb. He leads the brutal slaughter of a pig, and then Simon. He fosters rebellion. He has his minions beat a kid named Wilford for some unspecified misdeed. He throws a spear at Ralph with full intention, trying to kill him, and then sends the minions after him to finish the job. Well, but he couldn't do any of this without power, and somehow he gets it. When he leaves Ralph's group, he convinces the others to come with him by promising a hunt. The preteen boys aren't inherited in Ralph's Boy Scout team building and fire watching. They want blood, and once Jack gets control, he turns from a coy boy into a a great log head being dragged into the center of the lawn, and Jack, painted and garlanded, sat there like an idol. Well, another reference. Power lay in the brown swell of his forearms. Authority sat on his shoulder and chattered in his ear like an ape. All sit down, the voice of authority. And at another place he says, it says that the boys ranged themselves in rows on the grass before him, but Ralph and Piggy stayed a foot lower. Standing on the soft sand, Jack ignored them for the moment, turned his mask down to the seated boys and pointed at them with his spear. Well, Jack is an idol, or wants to be an idol, with an ape sitting on his shoulder. He's no longer a little boy. He's a chief, a self-proclaimed chief. And not only the boys, but the narrator actually calls him the chief. The chief was sitting there, naked to the waist, his face blocked out in white and red. Jack? There's no Jack by this point. Jack is just a name covering up the ugly, primitive core beneath the British choir boy exterior. When Jack picks up a spear and then walks out on Ralph's pitiful attempt to impose order, he's not a boy anymore. He's a savage. And if you are thinking that this all sounds a little racist, we think you're right. Because when we discuss the theme of primitivity, we also discuss the same thing as well. And now we will definitely talk on and elaborate on it later too. Well, and a word about kid stuff. By the end of the book, we see that Jack has become a subhuman terror, inspiring panic in Ralph and awe in the rest of the boys. Or has he, throughout the whole story, we get little hints that this might be nothing more than a game gone wrong. When Jack leaves Ralph's group, check now what he does. His voice trailed off. The hands that held the conch shook. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly. All right then. He laid the conch with great care in the grass at his feet. The humiliating tears were running from the corner of each eye. I'm not going to play any longer, not with you. Does this sound like a savage psychopath in the making, or does it sound like a little boy who's mad that things aren't fair, aren't going well? Well, what's cool about this movement is that Golding mostly keeps us in the boy's viewpoint, and particularly Ralph's. These are the question and the rather teasers that I'm exchanging with you to think about these things. When they are scared, we are scared too. When they are having a fun pig-killing orgy, we are having a fun pig-killing orgy too. But occasionally he drops in movements like this, where we see the boys in a new way, as kids playing a game gone horribly wrong somewhere. At the end, what we see things from the naval officer's perspective, a civilized, orderly, wise perspective of an adult. He asks who is in charge, assuming very Britishly that someone would be. And Ralph sets up. Keep in mind that being in charge also means taking some sort of responsibility for, the two gruesome murders too. Maybe that's why Jack ends up hanging back. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. To the boys, Jack is a powerful savage chief. To the officer and to us, he's just a little boy wearing goofy clothes. Golding leaves us with a question. What is Jack really? Is he a heartless savage, or is he just a little British boy playing a game? So this was one perspective regarding Jack's character. Now let's have another look at the same character from another perspective. Well, we know that the strong-willed, egomaniacal Jack is the novel's primary representative of the instinct of savagery, violence, and desire for power. In short, the antithesis of Ralph, or in other simple words, he may be known as antagonist. From the beginning of the novel, Jack desires power above all other things. He's furious when he loses the election to Ralph and continually pushes the boundaries of his subordinate role in the group. Early on, Jack retains the sense of moral property and behavior that society instilled in him. In fact, in school, he was the leader of the choir boys. The first time he encounters a pig, he is unable to kill it. But Jack soon becomes obsessed with hunting and devotes himself to the task entirely, painting his face like a barbarian and giving himself over to blood, lust, and violence. The more savage Jack becomes, the more he is able to control the rest of the group. Indeed, apart from Ralph, Simon, and Piggy, the group largely follows Jack in casting off moral restraint and embracing violence and savagery. Jack's love of authority and violence are intimately connected, as both enable him to feel powerful and exalted. By the end of the novel, Jack has learned to use the boys' fear of the beast to control their behavior. A reminder of how religion and superstition can be manipulated as instruments of power. Well, Simon's character, if we look at it carefully, we will find that the first time we see Simon, he's fainting and things go downhill from there. From passing out to throwing up to hallucinating to getting bloody noses, Simon is walking mess. But he's anything but weak. Power in all the wrong places is about basically Simon, maybe a little timid, but he's a compassionate boy, a skinny, vivid boy. Simon's innate goodness comes out in his actions too. He recovers Piggy's glasses when they fly off his face post Jack's punch. He gives Piggy his own share of meat, and he helps the little ones pick fruit. Found for them the fruit they could not reach, pulled off the choicest from up in the foliage, passed them back down to the endless, outstretched hands. And of course he doesn't turn into a primitive savage and go around killing things. He's also wise, mature and insightful to the point of being prophetic. He's the only one except Piggy who understands the beast. Simon, walking in front of Ralph, felt a flicker of incredulity, a beast with claws that scratched, that sat on a mountain top, that left no tracks and yet was not fast enough to catch Simon Eric. However, Simon thought of the beast. There rose before his inward sight the picture of a human, at once heroic and sick. Well, Simon from his little leafy meditation cave gets it. The island is changing them, is changing all of them completely. Being afraid of the beast turns them into beasts within them. If you are having trouble understanding this, let's literalize it for you. Like, he's basically saying that being afraid of an enemy makes you do such horrific things that you turn into the enemy yourself. You become as beastly as you are afraid of another beast. And by you we mean nations, by you we mean people, by you we mean any victim who is afraid of being victimized. And what it symbolizes here, governments and people ruled by them. Sound familiar, I guess, if we consider the 20th century background? It should be. It's the same kind of argument that some people make today about the war on terror. Well, let's discuss this idea of pig on a stick. What does it symbolize? What is it for? What was the idea behind it? And how can this be interpreted if we are discussing this an allegoric incident of a narrative? Well, Simon's freaky wisdom doesn't mean he is immune to the island's effects. Hallucinating and probably dehydrated, that swollen tongue is a good giveaway. He imagines we think the sweared pig's head talking to him. And that means Simon is ever wiser than we thought, because all of the head's lines are actually his own, like this. And I quote from the text, "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt or kill. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no-go. Why things are what they are." So these are the voices of hallucination, but actually these are voices by Simon's wisdom. So Simon is the only boy to truly grasp the beast is just all the negative, horrible aspects of mankind. And his "I'm the reason why it's no-go" is a direct answer to the question Piggy posed several pages earlier in the story. What makes things break up the way they do? Simon does have all the answers, but no one is listening or ready to listen. Of course, there's also the remote possibility that the talking pig's head isn't a mere hallucination. It's the actual Lord of the Flies. Evil incarnate talking to Simon via sweared nogging. If this is true, Simon loses points for not coming up with the intelligent insights on his own. On the other hand, he gains quite a few points back for being like Jesus. And we'll also have a word about Christ figure here too. We've got a Christ figure on our hands, if you could recognize here, if we can really interpret what writer wants it to be. To start with, his name is Simon. which happens to be the name of one of the 12 apostles. Simon started out as Simon until Jesus decided really his name should be Peter instead, because Peter means rock. And Simon was the rock on which Jesus would build his church. If you glance at our nutshell, you'll notice that Lord of the Flies is a response to an earlier and much more cheerful Boys on a Desert Island book. In fact, the Coral Island is a kind of the same story. Golden even borrowed the names Ralph, Jack and Peterkin, except Peterkin ended up as Simon. Well, going further, and then there is Simon's affinity for meditation, his kindred spiritness with animals, his attitude, and his ability to prophesize, like when he tells Ralph that Ralph will get home, and sort of suggests that he himself won't. Having established that, we can go back to our pig's head on a stick scene and compare it to Jesus' visit to the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he was crucified. And when we say visit, what we really mean is long and solitary mental suffering, much like Simon undergoes the night before he meets his own ultimately death. Simon, like Jesus, is thirsty and later very thirsty, and although the text doesn't say it, we can only assume that at one point later he's very, very, very thirsty. He's also sweating, having a seizure and bleeding profusely from his nose. So if Simon's night before matches up with Jesus' night before, then does Simon die for the sins of the boys? Well, are they somehow saved by his death? It's hard to say, but it does seem meaningful that he alone had the knowledge of the beast's true nature. He alone had the potential to save the boys from themselves and their fear, and they basically kill him for trying to spread the good news, consciously or unconsciously. Well, the tragic part is that Simon says the beast is only us, and then gets pegged as the beast himself, even though he's the least beast-like of any of the boys. The question is whether, like Jesus, being non-beastie makes him more or less human. And another perspective regarding this idea says that whereas Ralph and Jack stand at opposite ends of the spectrum between civilization and savagery, Simon stands on an entirely different plane from all the other boys. Simon embodies a kind of innate spiritual human goodness that is deeply connected with nature and in its own way as primal as Jack's evil, or evil in anyone's or within. The other boys abandon moral behavior as soon as civilization is no longer there to impose it upon them. They are not innately moral, rather the adult world. The threat of punishment for misdeeds has conditioned them to act morally. However, as soon as this condition is over, they are beyond this limitation. To an extent, even the seemingly civilized Ralph and Piggy are products of social conditioning too, as we see when they participate in the hunt dance. In Golding's view, the human impulse towards civilization is not as deeply rooted as the human impulse towards savagery. Unlike all the other boys on the island, Simon acts normally, not out of guilt or shame, but because he believes in the inherent value of morality. We find here that in Golding's view, the human impulse towards civilization is not as deeply rooted as the human impulse towards savagery. Unlike all the other boys on the island, we see that Simon acts morally not out of guilt or shame, but because he believes in the inherent value of morality. he behaves kindly toward the younger children, and he is the first to realize the problem posed by the beast and the Lord of the Flies. That is, that the monster on the island is not a real, physically beast, but rather a savagery that lurks within each human being. The soul's head on the stake symbolizes this idea very clearly, as we see in Simon's vision of the head speaking to him, or in other words, if we call it hallucination. Ultimately, what happens that this idea of the inherent evil within each human being stands strong as the moral conclusion and central problem of the novel, to be the major conflict. Against this idea of evil, Simon represents a contrary idea of essential human goodness. However, his brutal murder at the hands of the other boys indicates the scarcity of that good aimed and overwhelming abundance of evil. And this makes me finish this talk today here, where we are still left with a talk on allegory and character analysis. So what we are doing in these lectures, in the previous lecture I started with the theme, symbols and allegories, and I could not finish some of them because now they are going to be discussed as allegory too, with the connection of this talk as well. So in the coming lecture I'll be combining the things which are allegorically important with the themes which are also enhancing the themes, and we'll try to bring them together into characters to extend my views on character sketches as well. So basically we are taking all three things together side by side, so to make it easy for you to link them together. I finished my today's talk here, where I discussed three of these characters in detail, and will be extending on this discussion in my coming talk, lecture 19. This was all for today. Allah Hafiz.